Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Open Nurses Psychedelic Chat. I'm Andrew Penn. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Nurses, and I'm really happy to be joined tonight by Dr. Christine Rodriguez, who is a Two-Spirit Afro-Indigenous scholar at Yale, whose scholarly inquiry encompasses 2SL LGBTQIA plus healthcare with a specialization in gender-affirming care, Native and Indigenous healthcare, innovative technologies within healthcare simulation, intersectional stigma, entheogens, and consciousness, as well as advocating for the importance of religion and spirituality within healthcare settings. She serves as an assistant professor and assistant dean of simulation and clinical innovation at Yale University School of Nursing and is an affiliate faculty for the Yale Institute for Global Health. I also want to introduce her by her Indigenous name, which I'm hoping to get this right, Katikaniki. And if I can bring you onto the screen, Dr. Rodriguez. Thank you.
Yes.
Hey, welcome. Nice to see you.
Likewise. Thank you, Andrew. And yeah, you hit it right on the dot. Katikaniki.
Okay.
So thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introduction. Really grateful to be here. Shout out to you all in Open Nurses for fostering a space to amplify voices of my community, and really thrilled to be here with you all. And yeah, just excited.
Yeah, well, we do this once a month to highlight people that are working in that intersection between psychedelics and nursing and some of our colleagues and allies in this space. And it's really fantastic to get to meet people on here and to share the work that you're doing. So, we often start out just asking people about how did you get here? What was the trajectory of your nursing career? And, if psychedelics were a part of, the work that you're doing in that, be interested in knowing a little more about that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. My journey in nursing was not very linear, and I'm happy to share with that. And like you said, I come from Yale School of Nursing, which is land of Quinnipiac, so land and waterways of the Quinnipiac people. So just giving honor and respect to those folks. But yeah, my journey was very interesting. I never wanted to become a nurse. I always had an interest in healthcare. I kind of had a fascination with anesthesiology. So I wanted to be an anesthesiologist assistant. This was kind of big in Florida at the time when I was in school. And I was like, you know what, that's what I want to do. And so I kind of did that. I kind of had my first degree in bio and really enjoyed that. And then all of a sudden went to a conference. I was a part of an honor society. And the president, I was the vice president. The president at the time said, well, have you thought about nurse anesthetists? And I said, I don't even know what that is. And she's like, you should look it up. And so I took the time, I went home, looked at it, and I was like, whoa. I said, this is a whole interesting field. I was like, it's kind of what I want to do with anesthesiologist assistant, but you've got a nursing perspective behind it. So I did a lot of research with it and said, okay, time to switch majors. So I ended up switching majors. And it was a very interesting time in my life where I was very interested in going into seminary school while also wanting to go into nursing school. And I had this kind of battle of trying to figure out where I would end up being. So I applied to both nursing school and seminary school at the time. And this was for my undergrad. So I was doing a bachelor's in seminary. It was going to be a bachelor's of theology. And then I thought about doing a bachelor's of nursing. And as the universe would have it, I did not get accepted to nursing school. And but I got accepted to seminary school, and which was quite a dilemma for me. And I remember telling the president of the honor society, like, hey, I didn't get into nursing school, because she asked me, like, did you get in? And I said, no, I actually did not get in. I said, but I can always try again next year. She said, this doesn't make any sense. Here, contact the person at registrar and find out what's going on. So I went in and I contacted the guy at registrar, and he said, it doesn't seem like you're taking anatomy, and that's the reason why we chose not to admit you. And I said, but I am taking anatomy. I'm in the prereq now. And then they were like, oh, we missed this on our end. We can give you a spot at a satellite campus for nursing, and we can accept you. So that was the start of my journey in nursing. Was I ended up not going to the main campus, but the satellite campus of the university I was at, and started my nursing trajectory alongside my bachelor's degree in seminary in theology and in a bachelor's in nursing, which was fascinating. That's how things ended up. And then while in nursing school, I went to go pay my first bill, and then they said, you left 115 credits on your first bachelor's. And I said, you're telling me I only got a couple courses left? I said, yeah, you just got to reapply to undergrad again. So there was this period in time I was doing nursing and my undergrad, and I fulfilled my first bachelor's in biology and turned it into biological and physical sciences, and then leveraged that to let go of seminary undergrad and apply to graduate seminary school, where I got a master's of theology. So
Okay,
if you
that's
can
your that's your
imagine,
M that's your MDiv.
that's my
Yes.
that's my master's of arts in theology.
Okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
it shows you the journey that I did, because
Yeah.
so I did
Yeah.
nursing together with my master's of arts in theology. So I was taking about 32 credits a semester
Oh my
while in
gosh.
nursing school. So that's why I say not
Wow.
linear in any
No.
approach. And
No.
then graduated with my master's in theology and became a healthcare chaplain. And then really loved that. And then said I want more. So
Yeah.
then did my MSN, and then said, why not go with the MDiv also? So I did my
Mhm.
bachelor's degree in nursing with a master's of theology, my master's in nursing with my master's of divinity, while working as a chaplain and a nurse. And I became a family nurse practitioner, and then later on went to get my doctorate. So just a weird trajectory on how that ended up, because folks always ask me, did you do a joint degree? And I'm like, no, I did
No.
2 degrees, but not a joint degree.
Yeah,
So
I mean, that's the interesting thing about nursing is that, so many people in nursing have these really interesting trajectories on their career, and they pick up these, many degrees, but more importantly, just many different intersecting ways of seeing the world. And looking at your bio, I mean, that seems to define a lot of your past experiences, is this kind of intersectionality. And I would love to kind of unpack that a little bit, because these are different trajectories, but really quite complementary in a lot of ways. And I would just love to hear more about that.
yeah, no, that's a great question. And I agree. I think that that's always been the question a lot of folks in my career. They're like, wow, we can kind of see how these all blend together. But how did you see it in the beginning? And in the beginning, I thought it was interesting. A lot of folks went into seminary school to treat the whole person. So
Hmm.
you would often see physicians first go into seminary and kind of get a kind of
Hmm.
a little dabble on what seminary studies look like. We saw this with Darwin, even when he first kind of started. So I thought it was really interesting seeing how they decided to do that first. But yeah, the intersections are really fascinating. And I think it's interesting. I say, it's not that psychedelics in nursing found me. I would say it was more psychedelic in religion and spirituality that I found that connection more. So during my journey, I remember, I think my first kind of touch with this came in, well, we have Native and Indigenous kind of history with some of these medicines. So I was very
Hmm.
familiar with what our tribe did specifically with our medicines. And we worked specifically with a plant called Ananthera peregrina. And that plant we have a special name for in ceremony, that we keep that name in reverence, and we don't use the actual name we do. So we call it a tribal name, which is fascinating. So I always grown with the reverence of these substances. And
Hmm.
to me, it's powerful. And then when I got into seminary school, I think things just kind of clicked a little different for me while being in nursing school too. Was I started getting, I remember there was this really interesting paper that we got in I think it was my second year of seminary for my master's of divinity. And it was this kind of Q source paper trying to look at synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And
Hmm.
the paper was just a comparison and a contrast of how these kind of gospels differ, and how do they kind of compare with each other. And I became very fascinated understanding who's the author behind it. And so we did this huge kind of analysis of, well, what was Matthew? And we're like, oh, Matthew's a tax collector. And then we're like, well, what's Mark? And we're like, well, Mark's just an adolescent, so he writes more dramatic. So I became very fascinated with how he started to write. And I'm like, well, Luke is a physician. Of course, it makes sense. He's combining themes. And then you've got
Hmm.
John, who's in this weird kind of space. But I became fascinated with John's connection to Greek, and this fascination and kind of painting this figure of this person of Jesus
Hmm.
in Dionysus. And then, of course, that led me down a rabbit
Hmm.
hole. And, I got into this whole world of, Eleusis, and wrote The Road to Eleusis, and then
Hmm.
Albert Hoffman and Gordon Wasson, and some of those early
Hmm.
kind of scholars, Carl Ruck, in their work. And
Hmm.
I think that's where it really sparked it, where I was like, I think there might be more to these mystical experiences we read in ancient texts. And I think it was this kind of colliding with nursing and seminary, because then at the time there was this, the article that came out with, I think it was psilocybin in the New York Times, and there was raving about, there's going to be this new kind of medicine, and they were claiming it a
Right.
psychedelic renaissance, right? And I think there was this realm of, all right, there's neuroplasticity work here, where I was getting the science behind it, but then I had
Hmm.
this religious, spiritual kind of connotation behind it, while still having the indigenous perspective and reverence for these plants. So it really kind of synergistically all worked out in the end, I always say.
Yeah.
But really, yeah, the intersections of it are beautiful, because then I do this now all day in my work where I'm like, all right, it's the whole person, the bio, the psycho,
Right.
the social, the eco, the spiritual. And that's how I kind of look at my care within nursing now.
Hmm. A little bit of housekeeping I neglected to do at the beginning, which is if people have questions, to put them in the chat, and we'll certainly leave time for those at the end. And if you want to put in where you're listening, we have a few people listening live. A lot of the folks will catch us on the replay, but if you are listening live and want to put in where you're at, it's always nice to know where this is turning up. Sometimes people, even on the other side of the ocean, tune into these, which is always a delightful surprise. So I'm curious about your Indigenous background. So you mentioned that you had a tradition with a sacrament in your upbringing. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think we grow in reverence and understanding how, and it is interesting, every kind of plant substance. So in our tribe, we firmly believe in animism, right? The belief that, there's spirit in everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is an important concept as it relates specifically to psychedelics, because I think when we look at this, it involves the interconnectedness of who we are. Early on, we were taught the importance of medicine, and it was very interesting because medicine to us is, and I'll give you a great example of this. Medicine is medicine. So a lot of folks will be like, "Well, you're talking medicine like psychedelics, like did you drive home?" And it's like, well, there's medicines that we revere for a lot of different reasons. So
Mm-hmm.
not too long ago, about maybe I would say maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were in ceremony as a tribe, and our behike, which is the term for shaman in our tribe, or a medicine man or medicine woman, they were leading us on a ceremonial act with a medicine. And one of the medicines we used was called jagua. And jagua is a fruit that basically you'll see across South America, across the Caribbean, in different paints. But it's that typical black kind of paint that you see a lot of indigenous folks wear in South America,
Mm-hmm.
used as an insect repellent, anti-inflammatory, different purposes. While we were in ceremony, we still revere this substance as a teacher. And there's a reason behind that. And I think it's really important to share that, because it kind of shows you how we revere these substances, these sacred teachers. So jagua we use as a paint, and the way that we talk about this paint is, we use this in ceremony where I will go with a fellow tribe person and they will paint my face, and we accept the medicine that the person gives to us.
Mm-hmm.
And before we even go in ceremony, it's very special. I mean, we have to be cleansed. We have to make sure, we're one with the world, one with the spirit. Make sure we clean off all our bodies with our special way, another medicine that we use to clean ourselves with. So even that is really special in itself, that we revere jagua, not necessarily what we think of transformational medicine, but a fruit. But
Mm-hmm.
the beauty in it is the practice of mindfulness. So
Mm-hmm.
what jagua does is that you paint it on you, and you have to keep still for anywhere between 2 to 3 hours.
Oh,
And
wow.
you learn this practice of mindfulness, right? Where we're all calm. We're trying to learn not to move because the ink will leak out. The beauty
Okay.
of this is you don't know where it's going to leak out until the next day. So the
Hmm.
magic happens the next day, and you're like, why am I got ink all over here? And it's because, well, you weren't as mindful, right? So just that shows you the reverence for that kind of substance, that it teaches you things where we're like, well, we know that we don't know what's going in our body, but the next day, the medicine is teaching us that we weren't mindful. So that
Hmm.
shows us the reference we have for some of these substances. And it's no difference even with our sacred medicines that we use specifically within the Caribbean. And typically when we see these used, they were either inhaled or they were used through a snuff or a bifurcated tube where
Mm-hmm.
the shaman would blow through it. Another interesting principle too that I think is fascinating is the fact that you can have the shaman, a medicine man and a medicine woman,
Mm-hmm.
blow within it, and you can have a masculine and a feminine journey. So even the beauty
Hmm.
of what that is shows you, the interconnectedness of what things are. So I think, yeah, we grow with this fondness of these traditions and reverence for, what do plants do? Not just transformational medicines, but how can they help us as people? How can they help us be better health wise? And I think that reverence is what's key within those Native and Indigenous circles.
Wow. I mean, at the risk of asking a really ignorant question here, which I know you'll correct me if I'm off base here, but walk me through how would two different experiences be, contrasting a masculine psychedelic experience from
Oh.
a feminine one. I mean, that's fascinating
Yeah,
to me.
yeah, it's an interesting journey. I think sometimes I've even journeyed in spaces where I've noticed and I'm like, oh, this feels more warrior like, or this feels more of those qualities that I would kind of it's interesting. I would kind of label as masculine. And I use air quotes because, what is masculine, right? And what is feminine, right? But I think it's a really interesting part because sometimes I'll journey and I'll realize, and I'm like, well, no, this seems more masculine in nature. I see more warrior, like I see more like anger, more like it's very interesting. On a feminine journey, it's like I can kind of notice it. I almost feel this nurture kind of sense with nature. And it's almost like I'm nurturing nature. Like I feel more oneness in that interconnectedness. It's not that I don't get it in the masculine journey, but I do find this almost more focus with greenery, more with the nature, with the feminine journey than I do with the masculine journey. The masculine journey is almost accompanied with, this is interesting, and this is just my specific times is they're always rooted in something related to some trauma kind of experience of like, this is what happened and this is what you need to do, that kind of thing. So I always like that because I'm like, it's very interesting being two-spirit because you embody both the masculine perspective and the feminine perspective. And I often find that that's kind of how sometimes I end up journeying where it's like, oh wait, is this, and when I'm integrating it, I'm like, oh no, this was a feminine journey. Like, and I'm like trying to write everything down in my journal and thing. Now I'm kind of connecting the pieces. So, yeah, very fascinating. And I don't think I would have came to that conclusion that you can journey in that if it wasn't for our shamans who were able to say, well, you can have the masculine spirit blow in you and you can have a feminine spirit blow in you. And it's like, that does make a lot of sense. Yeah. I never saw it that way. So really just really unique things that you see that you're like, wow, that's powerful. And then understanding the teachings behind, okay, this can lead you this way, this can lead you that way.
And did you grow up with this idea that because one of the things I think sometimes people really struggle to describe in a psychedelic experience, and I'm going to sound just silly even trying to say it out loud, but it often comes out in that we're all one, we're all connected. There isn't this division between people or ideas, and I think one thing I've heard a lot about is people sort of feeling like they realize they define one thing by it being not the opposite. It's like I'm not, I'm me because I'm not you, and then when that other goes away, it's like, well, then what's the division about anymore? So I'm just wondering, in your upbringing, as part of your culture, like was that concept, because for a lot of Westerners that's a very abstract concept, right? Because you're either Republican or Democrat or whatever, like you've got these either or things. And did you grow up in a kind of setting where that idea was introduced to you in before your introduction to plant medicines?
Yeah, I would say no, to be honest with you. I think, well, I can kind of backtrack. I'll say yes and no. No, in the sense that I think we knew, our family knew we had indigeneity in us. Like we knew it, but it wasn't, it was something that was caused. Like I remember my grandma from very early being like, this is primitive. You don't want people to see this side of you, right? And it was always this kind of blending into society. Like we had to force ourselves to be like, well, you can't do these kind of things because then people would make you seem this way, right? So I think there was that kind of, I would say almost shame on our culture and kind of being like, well, we need to kind of blend with mainstream.
Right.
And then within the culture, it was very fascinating because even within Native and Indigenous spaces, the concept of two-spirit is revered and viewed as sacred. And so it's this kind of leveraging of how do you view westernized world and how do you view what we have here that wasn't that was as an impact of colonization, right? Where we were viewed as sacred people, we were viewed as, hey, these were the people that were selected by the creator to have two spirits, to have the masculine and the feminine. So even within Native and Indigenous circles, like our term for two-spirit is a Biawaiza. And that basically is the term we utilize to embody it. But you'll find this across all Native communities. They have a term for two-spirit people. And two-spirit doesn't have to necessarily be like, oh, just feminine, feminine. You might see feminine, masculine, masculine, feminine, 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 different variations of what genders look like. And I always give the explanation of, there was a really great article on the National Geographic talking about the Buji Society in Indonesia and how they encompass 5 different genders. And this is exactly the model that you would see typically prior to being colonized. And I think what happened with colonization was, okay, now we're going to create these genders, right? Okay, we're going to create what is a man, what is a woman. And this is when you start kind of seeing this kind of shift into, no, this is how things should be. But this has always existed within Native and Indigenous circles of saying, no, we recognize that there's folks who are two-spirit, and these two-spirit individuals carry the ability to be sacred, and we revere them in our tribe. They are the warriors while being the nurturers. And it was revered, well revered, because of that ability to do that.
Yeah.
So I would say a mixture of both.
It's a kind of spaciousness, really, that
Yeah,
you're not having to choose one or the other. It's all the above, all
yeah,
that is available to you. Yeah, and it would seem like it allows perhaps the perspective that allows you to kind of go between spaces
mm,
as well. I mean,
you got it.
I think this about nurses sometimes, that nurses often, somebody described nurses as being very interstitial, like we're
Mm,
everywhere and nowhere all at once. Like you
I
don't
like
really.
that.
I heard it once described as like, if healthcare is like a brick wall, nurses are the mortar between the bricks.
Mm,
And when you look at
yeah,
the wall, you don't that's not necessarily what your eye goes to, but they're everywhere. Um, and that sort of parallels also, many people's psychedelic experiences, as well as this ability to kind of step back and away from these categories of either or,
you got
this
it.
and that. Yeah.
And I think you speak really well to this point, because I think when we look at this physicality, it's a duality. Everything that we do is very dualistic in nature, right? We're governed by time and space. So I always look at before, after, up and down, even just the constructs of what that is. There's a duality to what exists in this physicality. And I think when we use some of these psychedelics, the ability to transcend that duality, right? And to see, okay, well, wait a second, now I'm interconnected. I'm one with this, I'm one with that. What is gender? Right now you actually get to a point where you're like, wait, what a sec, what is gender? What are these socially constructed things we've developed? What is good? What is
Yeah.
bad? Right? And we're leveraging the paradox of this duality in those spaces, which is beautiful, because I always kind of liken it, and I tell people, I'm like, we're really governed by time and space in this duality, but when you enter other dimensions, I think even through meditative states and altered states, right, it's not as simple as a dualistic nature, right? And I think that's what's so powerful about these medicines, is the ability to really tap into that consciousness, right? And to say, well, wait, what are we? Who am I? What am I?
Hmm.
I often find myself asking a lot of those questions in those spaces. And it used to be, who am I? And now it's more of like, what am I? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
it's not just a who. If I'm saying who,
Hmm.
it's like who or what or where. Like, a lot of questions that I find myself asking within those journeys and experiences, where I'm like, wow. And then to come back down and then be like, kind of like, oh, well, now we got to go back to the duality of what this is, right? Really, really tough thing to grapple with too.
Yeah, and that seems to be one of the many challenges of integration, right? Is how do you dip your toe into that world where things are much more complicated and much more vast than we imagine them to be in this sort of ordinary consciousness world, and then come, to get out of the pool, and then sort of be, it's like getting out of the pool when you're a kid and suddenly it's like you're cold, right? And you're thrust back into a different world.
You got it.
And it seems like that's a place that many of us struggle to know how do you take what you've experienced in there? I don't always say learn, because even learning
Yeah.
sometimes feels like kind of extractive, right? It's like, I'm going to take this thing and bring it out into my business, like,
Yeah.
and make money out of it, or whatever it is. People come out of these. There's many a story in the psychedelic space of, I don't know, somebody, having something at Burning Man and deciding, that that's what they needed to sink all their venture capital into and save the world with it.
You got it.
But like, how is there anything from your lineage or your experiences that suggest ways to hold those experiences in the quotidian day-to-day life? You got a meeting on Zoom and you got to go in and teach a class, or see patients, or whatever it is that you do in your day-to-day life, like, what was that old Jack Cornfield line, after the ecstasy, the laundry, like, you got to go, you got to go do your life, right? So, like, I mean, any thoughts on how do you bring those learnings into the rest of your world?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, I think it's a complex question, but a really great one, because I think this is our struggle, right? I think this is our struggle, that human experience. How do we humanize what we saw there, right? And then how do we learn to live with that? And I think integration is key. I always tell folks, it's interesting. A lot of folks are like, yeah, psychedelics, and I'm like, I'm more interested in the integration,
Yeah.
because I think that integration is so pivotal to what these medicines will show you. I think for me in those spaces, I find myself doing two things, and I'm grateful for my community and my tribe to be able to say, okay, I've integrated my experience and I'm able to write this. But then I have the ability to also go to a shaman, right? And my medicine man or a medicine woman, and kind of be like, great, I just had this and experience and I want to talk more about it. And I look for those elders, those tribal elders, to kind of say, hey, here's the guidance, here's how I can help you with that. And it's tough in this space. It almost feels isolated a bit, right? And
Mhm.
I often find when I talk about this kind of work, it's like, oh, she's really out there. And when I talk about it within my community, it's almost like, and the nurses and the folks involved in this field, it's like, no, we get this. We know what it is. But when we bring that stuff upwards, it's like, all right, well, what does academia think about it, right? And what's their
Mhm.
view of it? And I look specifically at like forefathers who were involved in this, right? Carl was ostracized for this work in
Carl
Harvard.
Rock.
And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And you look at this and I'm like, okay, well, what's the difference nowadays for the nurses who are taking the lead in this work? And is there any preventative? Are they going to do anything for it? I think there's a little bit of fear in these spaces too, is like, what does this mean for us being involved in this? So I think
Mhm.
for me, I would hope that eventually we would let go of that fear and shame and say, no, this is something we've always done.
Mhm.
We're just bringing it to the forefront and letting you all know, hey, there's science behind this, and let's show you the
Mhm.
scientific. Where
Mhm.
indigenous wisdom was like, we had that wisdom. We knew that this is what
Mhm.
it did. We knew we used these plants to connect us to things. We
Mhm.
understood the foundational principles of animism. So I almost liken it. I explain to people, it's like I use what I've learned, and I take this such as a big calling. I was just recently at USONA, and we were talking about this, and one of the things I said, what the degrees get me, and what all this stuff does is it allows me to sit at the table where my
Mhm.
ancestors were considered, hey, I don't know, you're talking about making eucalyptus and this, you don't have the degrees behind it, so we don't trust you.
Mhm.
Those degrees now allow me to sit at the table, but I
Right.
carry all my ancestors and that lineage of the people who weren't
Mm.
having a voice at that table. So
That's
I'm
beautiful.
passionate about
Yeah.
this. Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's I bring all that where it's like, no, it's not. I bring a privilege of all those people that came before me, my grandparents, my ancestors, where they didn't have the space. Now I have the space because I have the degrees to
Mhm.
be able to talk about these kind of things. And I love this perspective. And I always said, I feel like I'm the bridge in a sense. And people are like, you don't have to be the bridge. But I'm like, but no, I feel like I have to, because
Mhm.
what happens is I'm seeing this tension between nurses and I would say all healthcare and indigenous people. And
Mhm.
it's kind of like, well, can we do this? Can we not do this? And well, there's an exploitation of products and commercialization and patenting of these plants in some spaces. And I almost feel like I'm the bridge between that. Like I can say, okay, well, we can't talk to indigenous people. I want grace. I want to extend grace to folks and say, I
Mhm.
want to be entering this space to bring these people in there. And at the same time, I leverage the importance of nursing and science and what evidence data does, right? For these kind of things. It's just the bridging of how do we communicate this group with this group, realizing that there's so much historical trauma caused by this group,
Mhm.
but come to a realization that we can do this work together, right? Because I
Mm.
think that's when we all look at this, I think that's the main goal is me as an indigenous person, I look at this and I'm like, I see what these medicines do for people, and it's
Mhm.
powerful.
Mhm.
And then I take kind of that hat and I look at my nursing hat and I'm like, well, I see the science behind this and I see the neuroplasticity and oh my gosh, there's great things happening in that area. So how do we combine both to create this synergy and involve the voices of people who were marginalized in this field, amplify
Mhm.
their voices, but then learn from each other, right? That's the
Mhm.
goal, is to be symbiotic. Is I want to learn just as much in the community from nurses. The indigenous people want to learn just as much from nurses. It's just how do we start those conversations, right? And I
Mm.
think it's almost like I look at it like you need that gateway person to kind of say like, hey, it's okay. Let's grace is extended. Let's have these conversations now. Because I think sometimes in these spaces I find that it's like, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing to offend. And
Mhm.
I love those intentions. We're not causing harm, but
Mhm.
even that kind of fear prevents us from actually going through what we need to go through, right? It's kind of
Mhm.
like, well, I don't want to address this question because it may come off bad. So then we hold it and we suppress it, and then nothing
Mhm.
gets done. So to me, I find there has to be a merger in involving the voices of this community, as well as the folks who are doing this research in it. And I think it's a beautiful blend because you're accounting for the history of what this is, and now you're saying, well, this is the scientific stuff we also have that the indigenous people and the native folks had already. We're now just
Right.
putting the name. Yep.
Right. And that's part of the sort of colonial tradition, is being able to name things and
You got it.
isolate them. So not to put you in the role of a spokesperson, but just from your own perspective. I mean, if there since you do really elegantly transit between these two worlds of sort of the indigenous world and the sort of more Western rational scientific world, whatever you want to call it. Like, if there is one thing that you feel like the science end should learn from the Indigenous folks? What is it? And vice versa. What is something that the Indigenous folks might benefit from learning from the science end of things? You know, if
Oh,
you
I
were
love that question.
if you were in charge for a day, you know, what would you want to make sure got communicated?
Yeah, no, no, I love that question. I think that that's huge. And I think that goes into that symbiosis, right? How can we learn from one another, right? And I think it's beautiful. I think from a space of, researchers, westernized scientific kind of knowledge, one thing that could be learned from Indigenous and Native people is the reverence and sacredness of how they treat these medicines, specifically, and the use of it within community.
Mhm.
And I think these spaces, these psychedelic spaces are looking at that like, all right, community is an important aspect of it, but
Mhm.
I think the community aspect sometimes gets lost because there's a big search on trying to figure out, well, what traditions should we use? Or, well, there's so many different ones. And, a lot of folks will be like, psilocybin, and they'll give credit to the Mazatec tradition and, what Maria Saban did in that work as a curandera or a wise woman, a sabia. And I think what tends to happen in those spaces is, okay, cool, we're going to give the flowers, but we're done giving a flower. And then there's not this kind of continual kind of like, okay, we did this, we did this, we did this, right? So I'll give you a great example of how this kind of presents itself sometimes. It'll be like, all right, Maria Sabin was the one who introduced Gordon Wasson to psilocybin. And then you have, this is everything that came as a result of Gordon Wasson's work, right?
Mm.
And I think that then creates this kind of conundrum for folks where it's frustrating because then it's like, well, there's no reverence or sacredness for what these plants are. And then there is this kind of fear, right, within westernized kind of medicine that, all right, commercializing this, is this the exploitation of people? So I see it. I see it in my communities where Native and Indigenous folks are furious at what's
Mhm.
happening right now in these spaces. I think the other thing for us is there's a lot that we can learn too from research, and the other flip side, right, as Indigenous people is, okay, how do we learn how to use this and spread this for all communities, right?
Mhm.
And that way everyone gets the medicine in a way that's healing for all folks. Because if there's anything that we want is, we understand the interconnectedness we have from an Indigenous lens. Look, okay, this is important. Our role as people is important. We're all interconnected. So imagine if we now understand that, hey, there's accountability for what these medicines, who these medicines came from. There's no kind of, oh, we do have a reverence or we have a sacredness for this. I think what we learn as a community then is, okay, now we can have the conversations of what this has done from a research standpoint. But we can't have any conversations, right? If we have no accountability, if we don't discuss the origins of what this is. So I do think that there has to be this blend of researchers, kind of
Mhm.
science, westernized world has to kind of say, no, these medicines, there is no renaissance. This medicine has come from these people, right?
Mhm.
And I think that would allow us to create space to say, okay, cool, now you're acknowledging us. Now we can sit at the table and we can have these discussions.
Mhm.
And I think once that's done, then we can also learn specifically. And I say we because I'm like, well, I'm kind of in between, oscillating between both spaces. But we then can also learn also from the perspective of like, wow, this is how you all do this, right? This is how we're able to kind of spread this out. And there's some great work where you don't necessarily have to patent the plant medicine, but you can still give the medicine out for all, right? And there's some really great organizations that are doing this work where they're saying, we're not going to patent the medicine. We want it to be free for all. So
Mhm.
I think it's this kind of give and take relationship where, Native and Indigenous folks can't move forward into these discussions without accountability of where this came from. And then we also have to approach this with humility too, to say, okay, well, science is bringing something, a different perspective that we may not have had. And we have to see what is the research that this is showing for us. Yes, we may have thought this existed based
Mhm.
off anecdotal, what we've done as a tribe, but now you've got science, right? That researchers are leveraging. And now we can kind of look at it and say, well, gee, that's what we thought as people, but they actually got the data behind it. They've done the studies, they've done the
Mhm.
clinical trials, and this is something we can't do that we've realized they've done. So it's this give and take, right? Where I always look at it as a symbiosis where we're learning just as much from them, just as we're learning just as much from us.
Right.
But I think that's the space often when those lines get blurred, the accountability, the okay, well, you're a researcher. It's well, how can I give credit to a researcher who did this to my people? And that's usually where Native folks go first. Is
Mhm.
you want me to do this, but you all did this, and
Mhm.
it's always the history that I find that they're passionate about. With science, I think it's the science, right? It's interesting. So there's always this joke within our communities that we say, science isn't the solution for everything. And if we haven't figured that out yet, I mean, just look at the proof that we can't figure things out scientifically.
Right.
So that we've always shared this within these spaces. And I think sometimes when I say it within even science communities, it's like, well, what do you mean? Like, science can prove it. And I'm like, no. I'm like, there's a reason why there's a holistic approach. There's a reason why multidisciplinary approaches breed to better patient outcomes.
Right.
So that's the reason I always tell folks, I'm like, yeah, we have to look at it from a perspective of not just one thing, like science is the cure to all. We really should look at it from that holistic perspective, like Indigenous folks looked at it, right? This concept of community and how we all help one another. So there's concepts to be learned from both groups. How we get to learning those concepts is a bigger discussion. Is how do we get to all sit at the table to have this discussion? I think there's a lot of things that need to be done first.
Yeah, it's almost like an epistemological question of like when science. So if a plant medicine tradition has this idea that this substance, whatever it is, this plant, this fungi, allows you to step back from your own experience, right? However you want to call that, and then we stick people in an fMRI scanner and say, oh, look, your default mode network goes offline. It's real, right? If we can measure it, it's now real, whereas before it was folklore, right?
You got it. That's it.
And somehow that becomes more legitimate because we have some measurement and some colorful pictures of the brain to say, see, it's real. It's not just,
you got it.
a story that those people tell. I want to bring this back to nursing, and particularly something you said earlier about getting a seat at the table. And, something was said to me years ago, Naomi Remen, Rachel Remen, who wrote a bunch of books, 25 years ago. She's at UCSF, and like My Grandmother's Kitchen, at My Grandmother's Table, and things. I don't know if you remember those, but, she made a very astute comment to me once when I was at UCSF with her. She said, she said the shadow side of nursing is power. And it's always stayed with, this is like 20 plus years ago now, and it's always stayed with me because it's one of those moments where like somebody says something, it just it just rings true, right? And I watch, and having started this, when we started this organization a few years ago, there was a lot of trepidation then about like, if I talk about this out loud, am I going to get in trouble? Is my nursing board going to come after me? Am I going to lose my job over this? And, and these all sort of reflect this fear of loss of power or that somebody's going to have power over us. And then the next level is like, well, that's just about like getting a foot in the door. And then the next thing is like, well, do you have a voice in the conversation? And what I was hearing from you is that like you have found a place as a result of your academic work and it being at, that little school called Yale, that there is something that comes along with that, and so could you talk about, your trajectory as being a nurse who's interested in psychedelics, and in some ways, I don't, it almost feels like because this is part of your cultural tradition in a way that for a lot of people it's not, there's also kind of a defensibility there too, that maybe people that don't have that cultural background, I'm Scottish, so our sacred medicine is whiskey. We call it spirits for a reason, but we don't. I think there's some psilocybin that grows in Scotland, but there's not a huge, plant medicine tradition there that I'm aware of. I'm sure somebody will correct me in the comments, and I thank you for that in advance. But I'm just really interested in sort of how have you found your way through that kind of what often feels like, I think for a lot of nurses, a minefield?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Andrew. It's interesting because I would have never thought that I would be saying this, but in a way, in this space, it's almost like my indigeneity gives me privilege, in being Indigenous, right? And I think that we understand that some of these medicines, right? We know these churches that are set up specifically in New Mexico with peyote ceremonies, and there is that kind of almost, I won't call it like a foundation or a stepping stone, but there's almost like this knowledge that, okay, the Indigenous people have used it, so they're good, right? So it's almost like you get a pass because you've used it, you're native and you used it. And then I find myself interacting with nurses in these spaces sometimes with the same exact trepidation you're speaking about. Like, if I speak on this, are they going to come after me? Like that I'm speaking on psychedelics. And it's a tough kind of paradox to exist in because, and this is where I kind of get so frustrated in this because for me, nursing is an art, right? It's an art and a science. And I think you hit it right when you speaking like, there's this power thing about nursing, right? And I always find like we as nurses, we try to hide under the auspices of medicine. And we're always trying to prove ourselves, right? So I even look at like the process of API, and that's assessment and diagnosis and planning and implementation and evaluation. When I look at ADPI, it's so scientifically driven, like it's so
Mhm.
science-based, right? We're looking at something, we're giving someone a diagnosis, then we're planning around that diagnosis. We're going to implement it, and we're going to evaluate it. And if it doesn't work, we'll go back and create another one, right? And it speaks to exactly what we do as nurses, is always trying to, okay, we need to do this. We need to do this next. We need to prove ourselves this, which is frustrating. And
Mhm.
I don't think we need to. I think nursing in itself is unique. I think we're unique in the way that we do things. We, I always explain to folks, I'm like, we're the Jacks, we're the Janes and the Julys of all trade. And I always use the July as like the inclusive, right? Those gender diverse folks that do it all. But that's what we
Mhm.
do in nursing. And I think if we hide under this model that we're just science-based, then we
Mhm.
lose the art of nursing and replace it just with science. The power thing is a very interesting comment, and I love that you brought this perspective too. Even from the early beginnings of nursing, I even look at like, we revere Florence Nightingale, but we give no credit to Mary Seacole and the work that she did specifically, right? So you're seeing this trajectory throughout nursing to follow. And I'm like, all right, we're just seeing it. It continues and it continues. And is it a power dynamic? I would certainly believe so. Do I think that as nurses, we've been accountable for the history, or do we speak up? I think that sometimes we hide because we're like, well, if we speak up, medicine's got the floor. They got a better AMA. They're more organized than nurses would be, right? And I
Mhm.
always hear this kind of comment like, well, medicine's got AMA. I'm like, well, what's stopping nursing creating their own AMA, right? And I think that's always where I lean towards is, what's stopping us? Are we our worst detriment in nursing? Like, are we the type of people that we say, okay, well, we can't do this because medicine has done it, or we can't do this because pharmacy will do it.
Mhm.
And I think that brings a bigger question to us that, we really are positioning ourselves to do this work. I mean, if there's
Mhm.
anyone who's called to do this work, I'm like, yeah, it's our social workers who are involved in this, and our therapists, but nursing should be in the forefront of this too. I mean, when I
Yeah.
tell you we're the Jack, Janes, and Julys of all trades, we do it all. I mean, we're at the bedside, we listen to the
Yeah.
last words,
Yeah.
we're providing that care around the clock. I mean, we are very intimate with the people that we discuss things with our patients, with our clients. And I think we just don't give ourselves enough credit for this work. I had recently I had someone who um a physician who looked at me, and this was really powerful. He was an anesthesiologist, and he was like, what do you do? And I said, I see patients Mondays and Saturdays. And I kind of said it in that kind of tone, like, just only Mondays and Saturdays. For the rest of the years, I'm like, most of the days I'm an academic, I'm an educator. And he's like, well, why do you say it like that? And I was like, well, I'm not seeing patients as I frequently used to, 4 to 5 days in the week anymore. I said, it's kind
Mhm.
of dropped down. And he's like, well, do you not think that the calling of you graduating all the nurses you've graduated over the years as an
Mhm.
academic educator is not as powerful as what you have done in taking care of patients or clients? And I really had to pause. And I was like, okay, that's 1,000 students, that's 2,000 students. Oh my gosh, that's 3,000 students in the healthcare workforce who are nurses. And
Right.
I don't ever see it that way, right? I just see it
Right.
as, oh, I have to do healing. Healing means I need to put the stethoscope on you. I need to do this. I need to therapeutic communicate with you. I think of healing in that lens. And to me, I'm like, no, what healing that we do to the world as educators, that we released over 3,000 nurses who are now nurses who are ushering in the next generation of our workforce. I mean, that's
Mhm.
powerful. But again,
Absolutely.
we turn it into, oh, I just do this I see clinics on Mondays and Saturdays. And that was him kind of being like, wake up, you do
Right.
more, sister. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you if each of those 3,000 nurses goes on to treat 2 or 3,000 patients over the course of their
Mm,
career, I mean, what's the force multiplier on that, right?
you
As
got
to
it.
how much impact you can have. Yeah, it's unfortunate that sometimes I think we only see our impact in what we directly do
You got it.
with
Yeah.
our patients, because that maybe that's because that's what we've been told, that's our value is, how well can you do addressing change, or, whatever it is that that you do in your job, but that the impact can be so much wider than that. Um,
Great.
did you ever experience any kind of pushback about your interest in psychedelics at
Oh,
Yale?
most definitely. Oh my
You-
gosh, most definitely. I think I wouldn't say at Yale. I think there's been a lot of folks who have done some work at Yale. I mean, at School of Medicine has done a lot of work with ketamine over the years, which has been really exciting.
yeah.
And there's we have a group that's really focused on psilocybin at the School of Medicine. I think in nursing, this is very interesting because there was a lot of folks who kept asking, like I used to do a lot of lectures on cannabis and breath work. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I would always laugh because folks would be like, well, there's a Kanawhaska experience that you can have with cannabis. And I'm like, if you mean an altered state of consciousness, then yes, but not ayahuasca. Yes. So it's very fascinating to me. And even with cannabis and breath work, there were some folks when I would speak specifically about the ritualistic kind of using air, earth, wind, and fire, earth, air, water, and fire, right? Using all four elements on a chalice, a steam chalice, right? This is typically what we see within the Rastafari community. Even just teaching folks about that, there was even some trepidation with some folks being like, well, what does this mean? Can you use this? And if you're creating altered states, and can you function as a nurse if you're altered state? And I'm like, well, I'm not talking about functioning as a nurse. I'm just telling you this is something people do. Then came this whole theory with cannabis. Well, I started hearing this in early beginnings with cannabis with, I'll never see a provider who uses cannabis. And I started hearing this kind of, talk. And I'm like, well, why is that? Well, they shouldn't be. And if anybody uses this, then I'm like, you'd be very surprised how many providers and clinicians in the community use cannabis. I said, and I said, you have to be very careful with those kind of words because some people use it sacramentally, religiously, right, as a sacrament. And that's kind of how those beginning conversations started with me, where we have to have a respect for culture and have this cultural humility concept. And I think that's how I approach this space is like, okay, you may think you know about psychedelics, but where's the cultural humility in psychedelics? And that's with anything that we do. And I think that some folks don't approach it in that lens is, I look back at our early physician public health practitioners. So Jan Marie Garcia, Melanie Turbalon, who did that wonderful paper in 1998 that spoke about cultural humility within medical systems. And what's the difference between humility and competence, right? And I always say competency, great for skills, right? We can learn the skill to master it. But to have a competency related to culture, I think that's way more complex. I think having a humility towards culture provides a different perspective or perception on what things may look like. And I think that's how I approach these spaces. When folks talk about psychedelics, I say, okay, let's be humble. Let's humanize what this experience will look like first. And let's understand that these medicines were already used. They were already used in native circles. They were used in indigenous circles since time. So we can't sit here and say, okay, no, we can't do this when, hey, we've used these medicines, and let's kind of talk about the humanizing of this experience. So I approach it from that lens is I give you the historical underpinnings first. And that's with any lecture I tend to do is, even with my cannabis lecture, I will talk about the historical underpinnings of what cannabis looked like specifically in the US and the attack on the Black jazz musicians of its time and the immigrants that immigrated from Mexico. Once we get that, now we can be accountable. Now we can have dialogue. Now we can have diversity of opinion, thoughts, and perspective. But if we don't touch the history, there's no gateway for us to open to discuss these kind of things. So I always account it from that lens is let's talk about history, let's talk about culture, and let's be humble enough to understand that we can approach this with cultural humility.
Yeah. Having spoken on cannabis before, and a lot of people in the audience are really shocked to find out why it's often referred to as marijuana. As it was code switching and race baiting from the 1930s, to associate it with Mexican immigrants. Yeah. So we've got some questions coming in. Yeah, I think you and I could chat. I think you and I could chat all evening, but I want to make sure we get a chance to get some questions from the audience. There's one up here. Let me find it. How do you integrate these complex perspectives into the nursing profession, especially in such a sterile and cold environment as the hospital and university setting? Sadly, I think we all know a thing or two about that. So, you've got a really rich, wide view of this, and how does that run up against shift change?
Yeah, grateful for the question, Alexis. And I think these are the discussions we should be having, right? Healthcare, why is healthcare so sterile and cold? And I think that shows you kind of the perspectives of how far we have come from, right? When I even look at, healing done in Native and Indigenous communities, children are involved in ceremony, right? This communal aspect of what things are. And I think in creating these sterile and cold environments, we see this division of even communal gathering, right? We see, okay, well, you can only have a one visitor or two visitor. So I almost say like the healthcare system almost lends itself to be divisive. And I think our goal in this is how do we integrate these complex perspectives into the nursing profession is show what some of these communities have already done, right? I think when we look at psychedelic spaces, there's this big push to say, okay, well, how did Native and Indigenous folks use this medicine? And I think this is how we should be looking at it from that same lens is, okay, well, how did we view healing? As a community, as people, as humans. And what was that universal concept that led to that? I always look for those universal truths. So I look at, and this is something I learned as a chaplain, right? Where what are the universal truths that drive the human experience? And for me, it's love. People can sense what love is unconditionally and selectively, right? So this concept of love can be universal. This concept of death could be universal. So where do we glean on those universal truths? How do we use those universal truths and discuss them and humanize the human experience to say, hey, we don't want a cold and sterile environment. We want to humanize the environment because we know the importance of what set and setting is. So setting, regardless, on a cold and sterile can be very complicated. So even in these spaces, what do we try to do? We try to remove cold and sterility out of it and try to create communal aspects. So we're doing some of the work already. I just think that we really need to lean into that work and look at the people who have done this work already. How did those spaces look like? And when did this shift occur where these spaces had to be cold and sterile? Why did the shift happen? Why did we need to do that for, right? There always has to be a what and a why and where. And to me, I use those principles and say, okay, what are the universal truths? Why did we do this? Where are we going with this? And what was the purpose of this to create these cold and sterile environments? And I guarantee you'll probably trace back to something that was non-communal in nature, and trying to separate itself or be kind of divisive. But it's fascinating. I think we have to approach it with that same lens, again, with that cultural humility. And again, going back to the history of what it was, looking for those universal truths, and then leveraging those universal truths as a human experience, things we all do as humans, right? So I love the phrase, we're human first, everything else second. And I think that's powerful in this space because it's okay. Well, yeah, let's drop all that. And even looking at this, even in antiquity, I can take it back as Greece. The folks that engaged in the Eleusinian mysteries were folks from all walks of life. They all traveled to do this work, right? It wasn't like, oh, only a certain group can do it. Yes, it was one setting to do it in, but even in the settings, I would even say you could argue, yeah, there was Eleusis, and then there was the Diasyniac mysteries that occurred too. So I'm like, you had different sites where these were occurring. So it's not that we can't create multiple sites like this. It's removal of calling spaces. Okay, this is a cold and sterile space, but why is that cold and sterile? And why did we deviate from what was communal to a cold and sterile space? So I think that's the bigger question we should be attacking.
Yeah, I remember when I was a med-surg nurse, like visiting hours were almost seen as kind of like a pain in the ass. Like we would have this little conspiratorial thing with the unit clerk who would do the overhead page of like visiting hours are now over, because why did we even have visiting hours? Why not, if your family wants to be there, let them be there, get a bed for them, set it, this idea that, you are sort of taken out of your environment and put in this box until you are healed. And then you are let back out in your environment. And it just seems so removed from the things that make us well.
You got it. Yeah. And it speaks to that cold and sterile environment, right? Is why do we have to be removed from this community, this concept to what you said, isolated to this place, we're going to heal you and then release you back into the community. I always find that model so strange, right? We discharge folks and we say, okay, now go back into the community, right? And to me, it's like, okay, but I came from the community, right? So why am I not a part of this? And why isn't the community a part of this in my state? So yeah, I think you allude to, a big problem we have in healthcare with these cold and sterile environments.
Well, it's another reason for integration, right?
Yes.
How do we integrate somebody who's had pneumonia back into their regular world? If once they're getting healed. So the question here, you sort of, we get asked this a lot. Like, people send messages all the time saying, well, I'm a nurse. I want to be involved in this, either because, I have an academic interest or personal interest or whatever led them there. And then they say, I don't know how to get involved in this. So, how do you see nurses getting engaged with this work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't see it any different than us doing, I just gave a lecture to students on Friday and I was talking about this, that I said, this is no difference than you creating your network as a clinician, right? Okay, I need to find my FNP, I need to find my psych, I need to find and you're creating your social, you're creating that whole network, right? And I think the beauty of this space is that this network is so beautiful. I think it lends itself to, like, we're all people who really care to heal people, right? And I think that's powerful to say that, okay, you're bringing a group of people who really care about humanity. And then the goal then is, how do we bring more people to do that same mission, right? And I think similar how we create those networks, I need to find the psych in the community, I need to find the family, the pulmonologist. It's the same way we do within these spaces. Is, oh, we found someone who's an Indigenous person and they have a different perspective. Let me connect you to this person. My advice would be, immerse yourself in this field. I mean, you reap what you sow in this field. The more you get involved with folks in this field, the more you're able to, attend conferences, professional development opportunities, join organizations like Open, right? I think it fosters a space for folks to talk about this work and to be able to say, okay, it's not just myself. I think when you don't have these kind of organizations, it does feel very isolated, right? It feels like you're on your own doing this. You either go underground and are like, all right, well, this is the people that I know can do this. And I'm accepted by these people. If I go above the ground, I may not be accepted. So there's this fear always of trepidation, even in these spaces where, okay, well, if I say this, is this me my license, right? And I think we lean into authenticity, right? I think we should be able to say, hey, no, what's the difference between this substance and this substance? And if we're using medicine for medicine, medicine is to heal, right? So that commonality of healing should be the principal foundation for what we do. But I think, the more you immerse yourself in this field is beautiful. I would say, the way I find my connections are always through people. It's, oh, let me connect you to this person. Let me connect you to this person. And to be humble enough to say, I don't know it all. I think that's something we should do as nurses every day. Is, I don't know it all, but I'm willing to learn. Teach me, tell me more. Yeah. And I think that opens its doors to opportunities, as opposed to saying, well, I've done this space. Like, even me having Native and Indigenous knowledge, I still questing for more. And I think that's the beauty of it, is like, okay, well, what else is there to know more about it? And there's always learning, always learning. We're lifelong learners. We can't just sit here and say, I've got this completely squared out and I'm ready to do this. No, I think if you hear a nurse say that in these spaces, I think that is a huge red flag. I think that you should be able to say, like, if you find a nurse that says that, you should be like, no, there's a lot more work to be done here. I'm more of the nurses. I really lean to those nurses that are like, I don't know it all, but I'm willing to learn with you. Right.
Yeah.
To me, I love that, because now we're creating a space for learning together. And the fact that, hey, let's approach this. You don't know something, I don't know it either, but let's come out of this learning this together. And then let's impact our communities and teach them that, right? That's the beauty of our work as nurses, is that it's like telephone, right? Like, it's like, all right, I'm going to call the next person, and now I'm going to connect the next person. But immersing yourself in this field and not being so cautious about it, I think is key. But again, everybody's got their reasons, right? And I think it's said, if you feel that you have to be cautiously in this, okay, there's a space for that too, and we'll make sure that we protect, as nurses, we're going to protect that, right? So I always say, it's all of us together in this. We're nurses, it's not MPs, it's not CRNAs, it's nurses. We're nursing at the end of the day. So,
well, that's kind of a nice segue into this. I think our second to last question here, but this question of, do you have a few letters after your name? You've gotten a few degrees. Do you think that nurses need to have advanced degrees in order to do this work? Or can somebody who's a staff RN, BSN, associate's degree, can they do this work too?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. I'll answer it from my perspective. Is Native and Indigenous folks didn't need degrees to do their work, right? And they were able to kind of follow these traditions and carry it. So I look at it from that same perspective also, where, you can have the nursing degree, and yes, I don't think you need to have the advanced degree to be able to do some of this work, right? Even at the BSN associate level, you learn about the importance of therapeutic communication. You understand the importance of holistic care as it applies to nursing. It's within our scope, right? The importance of nursing ethics. I mean, you get these principles very early on. And I think all those application of those principles, you don't need an advanced degree to be able to do that, right? I mean, even I look at even just clinics, like ketamine clinics, where they do IV therapy, IV infusions, and set up with IV. I mean, that's a nurse going inside. If you know how to do an IV, you know how to do that. If you know how to therapeutically communicate with your patients, guess what? That's what you're going to be doing in these spaces. So I do think that, I don't think you need an advanced degree to do that. Like I said, I think the degrees give you a seat at the table sometimes, right? As
Yeah.
opposed to, okay, yeah, I'm a bachelor's nurse. Well, I'm a doctorate nurse, and I'm going to go in and speak at policy meetings, and I'm going to go to the Senate and speak. I think in those spaces, those degrees carry power, right? So I see it more in the policy field and the advocacy field. They're looking for those people who have those degrees for that. But nurses, and I love this comment by Kim, yeah, as long as you have the ability to hold space, hours with compassion interest, that's what we do as nurses. We don't need an advanced APRN degree to do that. We could do that from the associates. I would even argue LPNs do that. You know what I mean? Like it's all nursing when I look at it from that perspective, is we're taught these principles. And I think that's what's going to lead to a little bit more of who does this work? Because it's so large, right? Is it the advanced degree nurse? Is it the associate degree nurse? Is it the LPN? Is it the RN? Is it the chaplain? There's so many conversations regarding this space, but me, even as a chaplain, I still believe nurses belong at the top. And to me, that says a lot, where I've seen the scope of work I've done as a chaplain. I'm like, yeah, we do a lot of good things. But I've also seen the work that nurses do, where I'm like, wow, well, nurses do it all. And I'm like, where I give the spiritual component and guide and facilitate people through their journey, nurses can do that. They can kind of introduce that and kind of say, I'm going to start you with the stepping stone, and then I'll let the chaplain come in. The chaplain will do their full scope. The nurse has already started that. And often the nurse is making those decisions. Oh, I think this patient needs to go on hospice. Well, often it's the nurse making the call. All right, well, I'm gonna end up. I see some signs and symptoms that are leading me to think this, right? So I think we have a lot of power as nurses at the table.
Yeah, it's a quiet kind of power, but it's a formidable one.
Agreed.
Christine, this has been such a delight, and there's so much more I think we could talk about. There's one last kind of traditional question we end with these with, which is, if you could go back and give your younger self a little bit of advice, let's get the right one up. What would it be?
Ooh, I like this.
Knowing what you know now. I know we saved the easy one for last, right?
Yeah, for me, I think it would be more graceful with yourself, and realize that things don't happen on your timing, but on the universe's timing. Because I think often during that space, I remember being, in those years, like, oh, I want to be a nursing educator, and I want to heal people, and I want to do this, and there had to be a time that had to come for me to get into that space. And I think looking back now, I'm like, wow, where I was so urgent or so wanting to hop into things. I think we feel this commitment to want to heal people. And I want to do this, and I want to do that, and I want to conquer the world. Like I remember finishing nursing and being like, that's it, I'm going to save the world. And then my first year in nursing was like, wake up call. This is not how things work, right? So my advice to myself back then would be, similar to how nature moves is how we should be moving. And I think that nature teaches me a lot of principles. So the other day I was talking to some colleagues, and I said, have you ever looked at the pattern that birds move in? I was like, look at how the robin moves. And I said, it takes 5 to 7 steps, and then it pauses. And it takes another 5 to 7 steps, and then it pauses again. And I said, do you think that the bird is physically scanning its environment? Or do you think that it's possibly looking for safety? I said, what do you think that pause is? And why don't we pause in our nature as human beings and the things that we do? And to me, that would be my advice is, look at how nature flows and see how there's periods where it stops and it's telling you to stop. So it's okay to stop. And there's periods where, a hurricane may come in and it's full speed, right? So go with what that is, right? And be okay with what that brings, what the universe allows to bring, and be open to those experiences, as opposed to being so tunnel vision and thinking that, no, I have to do this way. The doors will open. It's just us listening and just following what, the universe is telling us to do. So be more graceful, be more gracious to yourself. I think I would do. And yeah, follow what nature is telling you to do.
Can't top that. That's fantastic. Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for this conversation. I think a lot of people very much enjoyed it, just seeing the reactions while we've been chatting here, and I'm sure the people that watch it on the replay will also. So thank you. We'll be back again in a month or so. We'll watch your mailbox for the announcement of our next psychedelic chat. We try and do these every month. And Christine, thank you for taking the time with us tonight. I know it's kind of late on your side of the country. Appreciate you spending this time with us.
Yeah, likewise to you all. Yeah, thank you so much, and grateful to be here with everyone.
Bye, y'all.